Welcome back to Opinion Journal Live. I'm Jason Riley. Our next segment concerns the Supreme Court, which is scheduled to hear a case tomorrow involving racial preferences in college admissions. And here to talk about it is Gail Heriot of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and a law professor at the University of California at San Diego. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
So Abigail Fisher, a white student, applied to the University of Texas at Austin and was rejected. She says the school held her race against her. The school says that it's allowed to take race into account under the 2003 Supreme Court decision. Is that the gist of the dispute here, Professor?
Well, I guess so. Of course, the facts of it are very complicated, but that's the basic point, yes.
And in 2003, the court rejected quotas, but said race could still be used, correct?
Basically, they had two cases back in 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger. One was a law school case, the other was a college case. Both were the University of Michigan. And in the Gratz case, they said essentially that you can't be too obvious about using racial preferences. But in the Grutter case, they said, hey, as long as you're keeping it, somewhat subtle, as long as it's not obvious to people on the outside, a school can do it.
And that's because it said that diversity is a compelling interest on the part of government, right? And that's sort of a change in the justification for racial preferences from the past, which used to be as a sort of remedy or as a way to compensate for past discrimination. Now they're talking about it as a way to bring about diversity, which somehow has an academic benefit?
Yeah, actually back in 1978 in the Bakke case, which was the original Supreme Court case dealing with race preferential admissions, Justice Lewis Powell, in a decision that was only his own, he used the diversity rationale as his rationale, and his was the controlling opinion. But there was no other justice that adopted the diversity rationale until the Grutter case came along, and that became the majority decision only in the Grutter situation.
Okay, now you co-authored an amicus brief in this current case, and it got into some of the more recent studies, some of them studies that came out since the Grutter case, on how these well-intentioned policies have actually backfired on a lot of minority students. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest change between the time of the Grutter and the Gratz cases almost 10 years ago now and today. There is now a growing body of evidence that shows that we actually have fewer African American engineers, fewer African American physicians, scientists, lawyers, college professors as a result of race preferential admissions. So it's having just the opposite effect from what most colleges and universities had in mind.
And is this a result, is this of a piece with the mismatch problem where kids who might do well enough to graduate or continue majoring in certain subjects are instead attending schools where they're sort of put in difficult circumstances that make it more difficult for them to continue and end up dropping out or not majoring in things that they otherwise would be majoring in?
Exactly. Some of your viewers might recall that Thomas Sowell, I believe, is the one who first used that term mismatch to refer to a situation where a student is brought into a school, college, university, what have you, and their entering credentials are well below those of the average student. And rather than benefiting from that, they're worse off. They would have been better off going to a school where their entering academic credentials would put them ballpark, in the middle of the class. They don't have to be at the top of the class. They don't even have to be dead center at the middle. But if you're too far towards the bottom of the class, most of these students would be better off going to a school where their entering credentials match, so to speak, those of their fellow students. Now, what we're finding is this is particularly true in the area of science and engineering. Something that a lot of people don't realize, and that is that African American high school students who are college bound tend to be more interested in majoring in science and engineering than the average college-bound white student does. But somewhere along the line in college, they end up dropping out in disproportionate numbers and majoring in majors that are less likely to lead to a good job, less likely to lead to a profession, certainly less likely to make them a scientist, an engineer, or a physician, or a dentist, or a vet, or anything that requires a scientific background.
Okay.
And it's the mismatch problem is very, very severe in that situation. We now have several empirical tests that demonstrate that.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you. I think it's a very important point to make. The assumption is that affirmative action policies are a universal good and that they benefit minorities, but in fact there is quite a bit of evidence, and as you say, a growing body of evidence that shows just the opposite. So thank you very much for joining us.